The Japanese were terrified by America's island-hopping strategy. The Pacific did not forgive mistakes. It was vast, merciless, and indifferent, an ocean where empires were tested, and only one would rise from the waves. In 1942, the sun blazed over the Pacific as Japan's empire stretched farther than any Asian power had dared in centuries. From the jungles of Burma to the coral reefs of the Solomon Islands, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath that burning horizon, the tide was already turning. This is the story of how America, wounded but unbroken, forged a new kind of war, one that terrified Japan not through brute destruction, but through silence, starvation, and inevitability. It is the story of a strategy so simple and yet so devastating that it rendered entire armies obsolete, the strategy known as island hopping. The Shattered Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States was humiliated, grieving, and enraged. In 6 short months, Japan had swept across the Pacific with mechanical precision, conquering Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, and advancing deep into New Guinea. Their Zero fighters ruled the skies, their naval doctrine was refined, their soldiers disciplined and fanatical. Every island fell like a domino, and the Pacific seemed lost. The Japanese High Command envisioned a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a euphemism for imperial domination cloaked in ideology. Their admirals believed America lacked the will to fight across 10,000 miles of ocean. "We will bleed them dry," one officer boasted. "They cannot reach us." But America's strength was never in distance. It was in adaptation. The moment of realization. By 1942, 2 men began to understand the true scale of the Pacific problem, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur. They saw what few others did, that to fight Japan on every island would be suicide. Japan's army was dug in, disciplined, and commanded by officers who would rather die than surrender. A frontal assault across the entire Pacific meant years of carnage and unimaginable losses. The old rules of war, capture every fort, every airfield, every stronghold, no longer applied. The Pacific was too big, the Japanese too entrenched. The enemy had to be defeated not by confrontation, but by obsolescence. This was not about storming the gates. It was about locking them and walking away. The birth of an idea. In early 1943, in the war rooms of Pearl Harbor and Brisbane, a new concept took shape, one that defied military tradition. Why fight for every island, they asked, when you can simply bypass the strong ones and let them rot? Why waste lives on fortresses that could be rendered irrelevant by isolation and starvation? The plan was revolutionary in its simplicity. Take only the islands that mattered, those with airfields, supply lines, or positions to strike the next target. Leave the rest behind, cut off and useless. It was not about conquest. It was about momentum. Each island taken would become a springboard for the next, a chain of steel and determination leaping ever closer to Japan. Japan's fatal confidence. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff dismissed the concept as fantasy. They believed no army could leapfrog across the Pacific without bleeding itself dry. The Japanese code of Bushido celebrated endurance and sacrifice. To them, the idea that an enemy would choose not to fight was cowardice, or madness. But madness was precisely what America needed. By mid-1943, as Japanese forces fortified strongholds like Rabaul and Truk, pouring in men and supplies, the Americans quietly turned away. Instead of attacking head-on, they struck at the periphery, capturing the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, one leap at a time. Each victory left tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers stranded behind the front lines, cut off from resupply, forgotten by their own empire. The Pacific turned silent. For the first time, Japan began to fear not the battles it fought, but the ones that never came. Entire garrisons waited for invasions that never arrived. Food ran out. Ammunition rusted in tropical humidity. Messages from Tokyo grew shorter, then ceased altogether. The ocean, once their empire's pride, became their prison. In these early moves of island hopping, America discovered something profound. A strategy could destroy not by attack, but by irrelevance. The Japanese soldiers who once shouted battle cries under the rising sun now stood on the beaches of forgotten islands, staring into the endless blue, waiting for an enemy who had already moved on. The war had changed. The Pacific had changed. And for Japan, the nightmare had only begun. Forging the path across the Pacific. For Japan, the nightmare had only begun. What followed was not a storm of battle cries, but the quiet rhythm of engines, the thundering heartbeat of industry, and the cold precision of a plan that no one had ever dared before. In 1943, America was not simply fighting, it was calculating. The machine awakens. Across the Pacific coast, from San Diego to Seattle, shipyards roared day and night. Liberty ships slid into the water every 4 days. Aircraft carriers, once rare and fragile, became the spine of a new war machine. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago no longer built for civilians, they forged a new kind of weapon, logistics. For every bomb that fell, there were 10 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts moving beneath it. The United States had turned its factories into an organism that breathed steel and exhaled fire. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy had more ships than the rest of the world combined. The Pacific, once Japan's home, now trembled under the wake of American convoys. This was not luck. It was the mathematics of war. The leap begins, Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The first test came at the Gilbert Islands, tiny dots on the map, but stepping stones to history. Tarawa, a coral atoll ringed with death, became the first true trial of the island-hopping concept. For 76 hours, Marines bled and burned under Japanese fire. Every yard of sand was paid for with lives. Yet by the third day, the stars and stripes rose over the shattered bunkers. Tarawa proved one brutal truth: island hopping would work, but it would not be merciful. From there, the next leap carried them to the Marshall Islands. Here, the pattern took form. Bypass the heavily fortified Jalowit. Strike the weaker Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Establish air superiority. Move forward. Each capture became a chain link, a launch point for the next assault. And as the Americans advanced, Japanese outposts behind them began to fade into silence. The strategy refined. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, planners refined the formula. Each operation had to feed the next. Every airfield had to reach one more island ahead. Every base had to support another fleet beyond the horizon. Unlike traditional conquests, island hopping was a living sequence, a series of controlled leaps driven by precision timing. Nimitz commanded the Central Pacific thrust, using naval power to carve through the ocean like a scalpel. MacArthur led the Southwest Pacific Drive, moving through New Guinea and the Philippines, reclaiming every promise he had made when he left Corregidor: "I shall return." Their twin offensives became a pincer of inevitability, one that slowly strangled Japan's empire. The Forgotten Armies. Behind the American advance, Japan's invincible garrisons remained, isolated, starving, purposeless. Rabaul, once the fortress jewel of the empire, became a graveyard of 100,000 soldiers. No invasion came. No rescue was possible. Their airfields rusted. Their ships sank in their own harbors. Commanders wrote desperate reports that never reached Tokyo. The jungle reclaimed their trenches, and disease did what bullets no longer could. The Japanese soldier, trained to die in glory, was now condemned to die in silence. Innovation in the shadows. Each island taken was not just a victory, it was an experiment. Engineers designed new landing craft with reinforced hulls. Amphibious tractors, LVTs, crawled from the surf like mechanical beasts. Airfields appeared on coral, built overnight by the Navy's Seabees, those unsung builders of empire. Within days of capturing an island, American bombers were already flying from its runways, striking the next target in the chain. This rhythm became unstoppable, each island feeding the next, each victory compressing time. The Pacific, once endless, was now measurable in air miles. The psychological war. Japan had always believed in endurance, that time was on their side. But America weaponized time itself. Every bypassed island was a message. You no longer matter. Each silent radio, each forgotten garrison, chipped away at Japan's belief in divine destiny. For the first time, Japanese officers began to question not their courage, but their purpose. The Bushido Code had no answer for obsolescence. The empire that had conquered by faith was now being dismantled by arithmetic. The ocean of strategy. By 1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. Each leap, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, brought the war closer to the Japanese homeland. Each operation compressed geography, turned thousands of miles into weeks of sailing. The Americans were not simply advancing, they were rewriting the geography of war. The island-hopping campaign had turned the Pacific from an ocean into a ladder. And at the top of that ladder waited Japan itself. The turning point. When Saipan fell in July 1944, Tokyo could hear the engines of B-29 bombers for the first time. For the first time, the war reached their skies. In one stroke, Japan's illusion of safety vanished. The empire that had once stretched from Burma to Hawaii was now shrinking into fear. From the jungles of Rabaul to the ruins of Truk, Japanese soldiers stared upward, listening to the distant thunder of engines. And understood, perhaps too late, that the war had already passed them by. And in that realization, the terror of America's strategy was complete. Spirit against steel. The skies over the Pacific were no longer blue, they were gray with ash and doubt. The ocean that once separated empires now connected them through the cold logic of war. And as America advanced, island by island, Japan faced not just a military defeat, but a philosophical collapse. The Code of Honor. For centuries, Japan had built its strength on the invisible, on honor, discipline, and death without fear. The Bushido Code was more than a military ethic, it was a faith. To die in service of the emperor was not tragedy, it was transcendence. Japanese soldiers went to war carrying swords as symbols of soul, believing that spirit could overcome technology. Their training forged endurance, obedience, and sacrifice, traits that had conquered Asia in a few short years. But against America's new way of war, against a nation that treated warfare like engineering, faith met its limit. The American mind. To the Americans, war was not ritual. It was geometry, logistics, and progress. Each decision was calculated, each movement measured in gallons of fuel and hours of flight. Where Japan saw glory, America saw data. The U.S. Marines advanced not as warriors bound by fate, but as engineers of destruction, supported by mechanics, radio operators, doctors, and mathematicians. Every bullet was counted. Every island had a deadline. It was not passion that drove America forward. It was process. And process never slept. Islands of despair. As the strategy unfolded, Japanese soldiers left behind on bypassed islands began to live ghosts' lives. Cut off from command, they hunted coconuts, fished with bayonets, wrote diaries no one would ever read. They waited for battles that never came, for enemies that no longer cared. In Rabaul, tens of thousands built gardens where bunkers once stood. They buried their comrades, repaired old rifles, and whispered that Tokyo would send ships soon. But the ships never came. The jungle grew around them, swallowing the walls of their fortresses, while the sound of distant bombers reminded them the war had moved elsewhere. For them, island hopping was not a strategy, it was a slow death of meaning. The death of Bushido. By 1944, the spiritual foundation of the Japanese soldier began to crumble. Bushido taught that surrender was shame, but what did one do when there was no enemy to fight? When a warrior's existence was reduced to survival, planting taro roots, boiling seawater, counting insects? Some took their own lives in ritual suicide, believing death could restore purpose. Others simply faded, losing themselves in the monotony of hunger. Letters smuggled home spoke not of victory, but of confusion. We have not seen battle in a year. The enemy has forgotten us. Perhaps that is worse than defeat. The machine of the future. Across the sea, America moved forward like a living equation. Each island seized brought the factories of Kansas and California one step closer to the front. Technology became destiny. Radar that pierced fog and night. Submarines that strangled Japan's trade. Aircraft that could cross oceans in a single flight. War had become industrialized thought, and in that transformation, Japan's warriors were left behind. They were fighting the past. The psychological collapse. As 1944 turned to 1945, something inside Japan shifted. Even within the Imperial Army, officers began to realize that courage was no longer enough. They could not comprehend a war where the enemy's greatest weapon was efficiency. The emperor's subjects had once believed in divine invincibility. Now, even the heavens seemed against them, as storms, starvation, and isolation tore at their morale. One diary recovered from a bypassed garrison on Ponape read: "We are no longer soldiers. We are fossils of a vanished empire." Two worlds collide. While Japanese soldiers starved in silence, American forces landed on Saipan and Iwo Jima with precision that bordered on mechanical prophecy. Every explosion, every bombardment, every landing was timed to the second. The chaos of war was turned into choreography. On Saipan, Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. On Iwo Jima, soldiers fought to the last man, believing death was the only honor left. And yet, when the last shot was fired, America had not only won the island, it had broken a belief. The spirit of Japan had collided with the system of America, and spirit alone could not withstand the machinery of a modern world. The transformation of war. By the end of 1944, it became clear that the Pacific War was no longer a clash of armies, but of civilizations. One ancient, built on ritual and pride. The other, modern, built on science and numbers. The outcome was not decided by strength, but by adaptation. America had reinvented war itself, turning it from chaos into industry, from emotion into calculation. The Japanese soldier was the last of an era. The American soldier was the first of the next. And between them, on those burning islands, the old world died. The twilight of honor. By 1945, Japan was fighting ghosts. Its empire still stretched across maps, but those maps had become lies. Behind every red circle on paper was silence, islands abandoned, garrisons starving, soldiers forgotten. And yet, the rising sun still burned on the flags fluttering over ruins, refusing to admit the night had already fallen. Iwo Jima, the mountain of death. In February 1945, the island of Iwo Jima emerged from the Pacific like a black scar, 8 square miles of volcanic rock, halfway between Saipan and Tokyo. To the Americans, it was a vital airbase. To the Japanese, it was sacred ground. General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, knowing he could not win, turned the island into a fortress beneath the earth, tunnels, bunkers, hidden artillery, traps buried in ash. He told his men, "You will kill 10 of them before you die. Do not expect to return." When the first American Marines landed, they met silence. Then the ground itself exploded. For 36 days, the island burned. 7,000 Americans died, 20,000 Japanese were wiped out almost to the last man. The black sand drank their blood until it glistened like oil. When the flag rose on Mount Suribachi, the image froze the world, a photograph of victory, but also of exhaustion. For Japan, Iwo Jima was not a battle. It was a funeral. Okinawa, the end of the world. Then came Okinawa. April 1945, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific, and the last. 500,000 American troops faced an army of defenders who no longer believed in survival. Japan threw everything it had left: suicide boats, underground tunnels, kamikaze pilots diving from the clouds like falling stars. 100,000 Japanese soldiers died. So did nearly as many civilians. Entire families leapt from cliffs rather than surrender. Okinawa was not a battle for land, it was a battle for meaning. It was as if Japan tried to drown the war in its own blood. When it was over, the island was ash. American commanders stared at the devastation and whispered, "If this is what it takes to take one island, what will it take to take Japan?" The shattered soul of Japan. In Tokyo, even the emperor's ministers began to see the truth. The cities were burning. The army was scattered. Supplies were gone, morale extinguished. But surrender was unthinkable. Japan had built its identity on the idea that it could never yield. Now, that belief became its cage. Kamikaze pilots, young boys, barely men, wrote farewell letters in delicate handwriting. "Mother, when you see the cherry blossoms fall, think of me." They took off knowing they would never land, believing their deaths could redeem the nation. But even the skies turned against them, their sacrifice could no longer change the inevitable. The unstoppable advance. While Japan bled, America built. Factories poured out ships faster than Japan could sink them. B-29 bombers flew from Saipan and Tinian, turning Tokyo into an inferno. Night after night, the cities burned, wooden homes bursting into orange flame, rivers glowing with molten embers. Over 100,000 civilians died in a single raid. And yet, the American generals knew even this was not enough. To invade Japan would cost millions more lives. Something else was needed, something final. The birth of the atomic age. In the deserts of New Mexico, a light brighter than the sun split the sky. The code name was Trinity. For the first time, humanity had created a weapon capable not of victory, but of ending time itself. When the bomb fell on Hiroshima, the city vanished in seconds, houses, hospitals, children's bicycles, all erased. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Japan's empire ended not with surrender on the battlefield, but with silence under a rising cloud. In that moment, the age of warriors ended, and the age of humanity's fear began. The Emperor speaks. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito reached his people through the radio, trembling, formal, human. He spoke of enduring the unendurable. For the first time, the divine voice admitted defeat. Across Japan, soldiers wept. Civilians knelt in silence. For them, the sun had truly set. The empire that began in faith ended in fire. The nation that worshipped death now faced the burden of survival. The ashes of honor. When the war ended, the American flag flew over Tokyo Bay, but there was no triumph in the faces of the victors. They had seen what total war meant, and knew it could never be allowed to happen again. The Japanese officers who surrendered bowed deeply, not from protocol, but from shame. The code of Bushido, once unbreakable, now lay in ashes beside the cities it had sworn to protect. Yet from that ruin, something fragile began to grow, a realization that even defeat could be rebirth. For Japan, the nightmare had burned away everything except humanity. And for the world, a new fear was born, not of armies, but of our own creation. The silence after victory. September 2, 1945, the guns fell silent. In Tokyo Bay, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, representatives of a broken empire stood before the world. General Douglas MacArthur read the words of surrender, while Admiral Chester Nimitz signed for the United States. Behind them stood the flags of nations, silent witnesses to the end of the most brutal war humanity had ever known. For the first time in history, Japan, the land of samurai and emperors, bowed to another power. And yet, even in defeat, there was dignity. The end of the rising sun. Across Japan, the fires slowly faded. Children searched for water in the ruins of Hiroshima. Farmers planted rice where factories once stood. The empire that had dreamed of eternity now faced the eternity of rebuilding. The rising sun had set, not forever, but to rise again in another form. The age of swords and flags was over. The age of ideas and reconstruction had begun. America's triumph, and its shadow. The United States stood victorious, its flag flying over 2 oceans, its industry unmatched, its power unquestioned. But even in victory, there was unease. The world had seen what human hands could create, and destroy, in a single breath. The atomic cloud over Hiroshima was both a triumph and a warning. It told the world that the next war might not leave a world at all. MacArthur looked over the bay and said, "We have had our last chance. If we do not now devise some greater, more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door." The empire that learned. In the years that followed, something unexpected happened. The same nation that once forged swords now forged machines. The spirit that had fought on Iwo Jima and Okinawa did not die, it transformed. Japan studied the enemy that had defeated it, understood America's power, and made it its own. Where the United States conquered islands, Japan began conquering markets. Where once they had built battleships, now they built cars, radios, and cameras that circled the globe. They had been beaten by efficiency, and then mastered it. The mirror of history. Both nations, once enemies, became reflections of each other. America, the victor, became cautious of its own strength. Japan, the defeated, learned to rebuild from ashes stronger than before. The strategy that had leapt from island to island had now leapt from war to peace, from conquest to cooperation. The Pacific that once divided them became a bridge. But in the quiet hearts of those who remembered, the ocean still whispered of the cost. The lesson of the Pacific. The island-hopping campaign had proven one thing. That war could be won by intellect as much as by courage. By patience as much as by fire. Yet it also showed that victory without reflection is hollow, that every empire, no matter how mighty, is only one decision away from ruin. The Americans had rewritten the rules of war. The Japanese had rewritten the meaning of defeat. Together, they had changed the world. Epilogue, Breaking Time. The Pacific grew calm again. The waves erased the footprints of soldiers, but not their memory. And as the world entered the atomic age, one truth lingered. Perhaps one day, humanity will again try to break time itself. But next time, the consequences will be irreversible.